Welcome, everyone, to the Newburyport Literary Festival. This is the 20th anniversary of the Literary Festival and the 5th anniversary of the virtual festival. We started the virtual festival, of course, out of necessity when the pandemic hit, but it's been great to continue, and it allows us to do events like this with people coming in from Montana, California, and local. I'm going to introduce our speakers in just a second, but I'm going to do some housekeeping first. First of all, of course, I'm going to thank our sponsors, the Institution for Savings and the Newburyport Bank. These are our founding sponsors. They've been with us for 20 years. We could not do this without them. Thank you so much. We have so many other sponsors as well, including the Mass Cultural Councils, the Mass Center for the Book, Joy Nest Restaurant, and several others. Please check out our website to see all of our sponsors. And I also want to shout out our bookstore sponsors, Jabberwocky Bookshop and the Bookshop of Beverly Farms. You probably know that yesterday was Independent Bookstore Day. We want to get out and support our local bookstores, whether that's in Newburyport or wherever you live. I am going to briefly introduce our panelists. I'm going to start with Tina Morris, who earned her undergraduate degree from Oberlin College and her graduate degree from Cornell University, where she helped build the first techniques for releasing introduced bald eagles. Her field research ultimately became an instruction manual for eagle restoration programs in other eastern states. She was formally inducted as an honorary Iroquois in the Confederacy of Six Nations for her work in returning the bald eagle to the nation's skies. Sophie Osborn is an award-winning environmental author and wildlife biologist whose work includes the study and conservation of more than a dozen bird species in the Americas and small mammal research in the backcountry of Grand Canyon National Park. She's contributed to reintroduction efforts for several endangered birds and served as the field manager for the California Condor Recovery Program in Arizona for nearly 4 years. Wade Crowfoot serves as California's Natural Resources Secretary, leading efforts to conserve California's environmental and natural resources. He has served as his secretary since 2019 and advises Governor Newsom as a member of his cabinet. Secretary Crowfoot oversees an agency of over 25,000 employees spread across 26 departments, commissions, and conservancies. Wade is also my cousin, and I am very happy to have him here. Thank you so much to all of you. And with that, I am going to leave it to this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Leslie, thanks so much. And thanks for all who are joining. I'm thrilled to be joining this Newburyport Literary Festival for the first time. And I know, speaking to Tina and Sophie, they are as well. My work, as Leslie said, is all about helping people and nature thrive together. So you can imagine how thrilled I was when Leslie reached out and said, would I like to moderate a discussion with these two incredible conservationists who are remarkable authors who have written two wonderful books. One of the benefits of serving in this role today is I had a chance to read both books, and they are truly remarkable. And we're going to dig into these stories, the remarkable efforts that they encapsulate, and then, of course, the process of writing about that, which, of course, so many people at a literary festival are interested in. Tina, Sophie, great to see you here today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
We're coming from 3 different time zones. Tina, you live pretty close to others there in Newburyport in the Northeast.
Right.
Sophie, you're in Montana, and I'm way out here in California.
I know.
It's really cool.
I love it that we can do that.
I know. Well, and as I sit here, I'm watching a mama hummingbird fly into a nest.
Nice.
My wife has somehow cultivated or encouraged these hummingbirds to set up under an eave, and so the last month we've been watching with our 10-year-old her hatching 2 small hummingbirds and feeding them. So it's just been well timed, given that my brain is on birds.
Yeah, that's great. Ours aren't back yet in Massachusetts, or at least not in our yard. So I'm looking forward to it. Good for you.
Yeah. Well, I want to, as we've talked about, we're gonna jump in with each of you and hear about the books and your stories. But I'll just share, at the top, some may know, but many may not, of just the challenge of birds across the world at this moment in time. I think, Sophie, you had put in your epilogue, you had quoted conservation biologist Thomas Lovejoy, who said, if you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. And the current loss of birds across the planet, both in terms of species, but also just the abundance of birds generally, is a harbinger of these environmental challenges we face across the planet. So I would say to all who are joining, whether you are somebody who enjoys birds, likes birds, maybe obsessed with birds, or not at all interested in birds, if you're somebody who cares about the environment and the planet, you should care about the work to restore birds in their habitats, because as go birds, so go our environment. So let's jump into this. And Tina, we talked about, I'm going to start with you and talking about Return to the Sky. Chronologically, this story actually takes place before Sophie's. And so it's appropriate that we kick it off with you. The full title of the book, for those who don't know it yet, is Return to the Sky: The Surprising Story of How One Woman and 7 Eaglets Helped Restore Bald Eagles. And Tina, much of the book is based in the mid-70s, right around America's bicentennial. Give us a sense of what was happening at that point with bald eagles, and how you encountered this challenge, and what the purpose of the reintroduction project was.
Sure. Well, the early 1970s was just at a very exciting time for the environment, because all of a sudden, all the problems that had been mounting up until that time kind of stopped when all of the government started paying attention. And in 1972, for example, DDT was finally banned after many years of kind of playing around with, well, is it really causing the problem with the eggshells? And that's the reason the predatory birds are all declining. And then finally, the EPA was allowed to officially ban its use. Now, that didn't stop it completely, but it certainly made a big difference. And a lot of different things were happening. The Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973. And because of all of this happening, it became a little bit apparent that the environment was beginning to be able to accept these birds back again. And some of them had been completely extirpated, like the peregrine falcon was gone from the Northeast. The bald eagle was gone pretty much from the lower 48 states. There were only 417 pairs left, and that wasn't sustainable. They couldn't have come back from that number. So when 1976 sort of loomed ahead, the federal government said, we can't have a bicentennial without our national bird. Now, a side of it is that it wasn't our national bird, as it turned out. It was officially designated our national bird in December 2024, but we didn't know that at the time. Everyone thought it was our national bird.
Right.
And so it turned out that they wanted somebody to do a restoration program, and New York State came forward and said, we want to do it. And the problem was they didn't have the raptor biologists on their staff to be able to carry it through. So it kind of was languishing. Nobody was going to pick it up. And meanwhile, I was at Cornell University, desperate to try to work with Dr. Tom Cade, who had started the peregrine falcon restoration program a couple of years earlier. And I was sort of hanging outside of his door like a groupie, saying, please take me on as a graduate student. Please give me something to do. I want to work with birds of prey. And he said, if you can find a project, I'll take you on as a graduate student. And just through complete luck and being in the right place at the right time and talking to some people who had some clout in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bald Eagle Project was sitting right there. And they asked Tom Cade if he would supervise it. And he turned to me and he said, if you're the field person with the Eagles, I'll supervise you. And that was it. And I was
That's
just
incredible.
incredibly lucky and incredibly inexperienced and naive and everything else at the age of 26. So somehow this all fell in my lap. So that's
That's
where the story began.
That's amazing. And I think what impresses me about both of your books is just the personal journeys that you document, and the fact that you were women breaking into a male-dominated field and required a lot of confidence and resilience amidst a lot of challenges. But so we're going to unpack that, but talk about your lead up to Cornell, because you didn't have, it wasn't like there was a march to do this work.
No.
You had sort of taken a roundabout way to get there, or at least, yeah.
Yeah, it couldn't have been more roundabout. I didn't major in science. I had a really hard time with science when I tried it in college. It wasn't working for me. I loved animals, and I knew when I got out of college I wanted to work with animals, but how do you work with animals without science? And so I worked in a zoo for a year trying to figure out, is this really what I want to do? Because this is going to be an uphill struggle. And then I knew it was. And when I was at the zoo, I became really interested in birds and bird protection and bird conservation and getting them out of the cages so that they can live in the wild. And Cornell was the place to go. And I'd read all about Tom Cade's work with the peregrines, and that's what I wanted to do. So I just arrived at Cornell and no science background, no idea of how I was going to get to work with Tom Cade, but I was just so determined to do it. And I think he just took pity on me. I mean, who is this crazy woman who wants to work with me this badly that she's willing to go through all of this? And that's when he said, you know, I think you can do this. I think we can teach you how to raise eagles. So the peregrine team at the time was an amazing group of falconers, and they were my teachers, and they took me under their wing and they taught me everything I needed to know about how to raise eagles and everything I needed to know about living by myself on the top of a hill in the middle of nowhere where it was just me and the eagles and no team around me, nobody to say, hey, do you think we're doing this right? What do you think about this? There was no one there. So he had to have that confidence, and I owe him forever for having it in me that he thought that I could do this job. I think one of the funny things for me after reading Sophie's book, and I'll let her talk about this, but it was like an evolution of bird reintroduction. I was at the beginning. I developed the hacking program for eagles, which was then taken by other states when they reintroduced their birds. But it was also picked up by the condors and project and a lot of other projects that happened 20 years later. And whereas I was the beginning of the evolution, Sophie was kind of the middle of the evolution of how do we keep this going? Because you might have released the birds, but we've got to keep them alive and we've got to make sure that the threats that are always there are not going to do them in the long run. So it's
Absolutely. And, and,
fascinating to see the two
and it's
books
complicated
together.
science, as Sophie's stories will elucidate. Um, Talk about hacking, because when I first encountered that word in both of your books, my mind goes to computer hacking or internet hacking. But of
All right.
course, what is hacking, and what were you evolving? What were you breaking ground on that ultimately was such an important part of bird reintroduction?
Right. Well, I can speak to the bald eagles. What hacking really is a falconer term. It came, which I didn't even know until I read Sophie's book, that it came from the wagon that they used to put the fledgling peregrines in to get them up to the hacking box that they put them in. It's basically releasing young birds without their parents. And so falconers would do it to train the birds so that they could then use them for hunting. And in our case, what it was taking fledglings out of the nests. They were feathered out so that they could live without their parents in terms of warmth. And they had imprinted on their parents. They knew who they were. They knew they were a peregrine or an eagle. And then raising them without the parents being around in a different place. So in my case, the birds were taken from the Midwest in the Great Lakes states and put into New York State. And I was supposed to be raising them. So they couldn't imprint on me. I had to make sure that they didn't know I was the one feeding them. And I obviously had no idea if they could feed themselves ever, if they were able to catch fish. So a lot of it was just trial and error. We didn't know whether this was going to succeed. And the whole hacking project of how to do it and all the sort of the things that worked and the things that didn't, and how do you band them so that you don't interfere with their flight because eagles are so big and they require so much wing movement when they're migrating and hunting that we had to make sure that all of that was in place. And so it was 2 years of trial and error and changing things until they worked properly and finding out about the bird's behavior. Are they different if they're hacked than if they were raised by their parents? Are we changing their behavior? That was really important. So that was what my
Incredible.
research was all about.
And the physicality of the work is really interesting because you're both involved in the science of it, but then actually getting out there and reintroducing is a lot of work. I remember in Sophie's book she talks about hauling an 80-pound load, and you had to climb up essentially a telephone pole 35 feet up where you all had set up this sort of the nest. And Tina, I think I read in the book that you didn't know you would have to do that, and as somebody who is afraid of heights, you had to find the courage to do it that first day. Can you talk about that and the other
Yeah.
sort of just the challenges there?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I was pretty clueless, and it never occurred to me that I was going to have to climb this tower to be able to feed the birds, to watch the birds, observe them, all that, take care of them. That what didn't really enter my my brain until I got there, and all of a sudden, my mentor, who really showed me everything along the way, Jim Weaver, who worked for the Peregrine Fund, turned to me and he said, "Okay, let's go up to the top." And I said, "What?" Okay. And I couldn't admit that I was terrified because I was a woman. The first thing that they were going to be looking for was me to say, "Oh, I can't do that. I'm terrified. I can't do that." So I just had to swallow it. And he went up like, you can imagine, he was used to climbing trees and doing all that stuff. And he looked down at me, and there I am at the bottom, and I had to get up there without showing any fear. And I don't know if I did show the fear. He probably knew all along I was terrified, but he didn't show it. So I did. I got over that hump and I went up that tower, I don't know how many times a day, all the time. I had a blind up there that I would use. I sat in the blind all day long and observed the birds through a little hole in the blind so they couldn't see me, but I could see them. And that's how I fed them. And so that was just one of the many fears that I had. And then there was also catching the birds when they decided to fly, because they went into the middle of the marsh. And so I would have to truck through the marsh trying to find them. And I had this little radio that back then was pretty, pretty, it wasn't that great. But I'd follow the beeps until I found the bird, and then I'd have to catch the bird and contain him, put him in my Jeep, go back up to the tower, put him up on top of the tower again, climbing the tower with him under my arm like a football, and put him back in his nest and give him a little talking to and tell him not to go again until he was ready to fly, because that was what they would do. Is the eagles are really clumsy and they're terrible first flyers. So the first flight is usually a disaster, and usually they end on the ground. So the parents will feed them there and protect them, but of course the parent was me. So that was part of the fear of losing them. I think was my greatest problem was, who am I going to call in Washington to tell them that I just lost the national symbol, or that he died under my watch? That was something that just plagued me for 2 years. Was these birds have got to survive under any circumstances.
Mm. Well,
So,
one thing I want to probe with both of you a little bit later is just, you know, given the work is both so important and you're each so passionate about it, how do you balance just the emotional investment into these birds, but then also the objectivity you need, as a scientist? It seems like it's a balancing act.
yes, it was a balancing act. One of the things people always ask me, why didn't you give them real names? Because I named them after the state that they came from and what number they were. If it were a female, they were number one. If they were a male, they were number two. But if I had given them names, I felt like all of a sudden I owned them. And it was like my pet dogs. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't want them to know me, and I didn't want to know them so well that I was going to get so attached that I would lose that objectivity. And
Yeah.
also, I wanted them to be wild. I think that was what was driving me more than anything. It was the freedom that they were looking at. These 7 birds, that they were going to be free and they were going to be able to repopulate their species. And that kept going through my head. So if I had started naming them all of a sudden that would have taken on a different tone. And so
Yeah.
I was very careful not to do that.
Yeah, incredible. So you ended up spending two summers up at that Montezuma Wildlife Refuge, and just talk about the arc of that work, and then as the work then transitioned to the State Environmental Agency, ultimately what did the project amount to?
Right. So it was always assumed in the very beginning when we took it on, when Cornell took it on, that I would do it for 2 years and I would write my thesis about the whole experience and I would basically spell out how to do the program, if it works, of course. And then the Department of Environmental Conservation of New York State would then take it over, and it would be their program from then on. And then it could be long term. They wanted to get 10 pairs of bald eagles into the sky. And so that would have meant several years of being able to hack eagles and also in greater numbers. Remember, I started with 2 birds the first year. It was kind of like, let's see if this works. And then the second year, everybody was a little more confident, and I had 4, which then became 5 birds. I had a rehabbed eagle come in halfway through. And that seemed like a very doable number for me. I could keep track of them. I knew where they were. When the state came in, they had more people taking over and more people on the hack site, and they started to increase the numbers of birds, and they also increased the numbers of sites in the state. So New York was really sort of the beginning of it all, and then the birds started, going to other states. So there's a bird that just recently died in New Hampshire that was a hacked bird from New York State. It was 20 years old. So they really went pretty far away to get to do their nest sites. But also the other states like Massachusetts, where I live, they took on the hacking program and they just used the same techniques. It was all ready and waiting for them. It was wonderful to see all these states coming on board and saying, oh yeah, we can do that. We can put our eagles back. And that was really great. And they did that right. Well, Tennessee was the last one. In 2020, they were still hacking bald eagles, amazingly enough. They were getting them from Alaska. So
So really a success story in many ways in terms of the reintroduction.
it was, and it might not have been. I mean, it was really kind of a hope that this would happen, but I don't know if any of us totally believed it would. And so when I hear about people saying, "Oh, I saw a bald eagle in my backyard," and I'm thinking, "Oh my gosh, that's amazing," because 50 years ago they weren't here. And the
Well,
fact that they've come back enough so that people are starting to see them everywhere in New England and Northeast and Virginia, and even Florida's population is, I don't know if it's tripled, but almost. I mean, all the states around have now got these really healthy, hopefully healthy bald eagle populations.
that's incredible. In my work too, I've realized that all of these
Yeah.
success stories have people behind them, and as you point out, we're completely uncertain. Whether it's the establishment of a wildlife refuge or a wilderness area or a recovered animal. The point you just made is such an important one, which is, back in 50 years ago, it was not clear whether we would lose the bald eagle. And now people of younger generations can take it for granted.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. Tina, I want to talk to you a little bit later about your life and the work post Eagles, but let's turn to you, Sophie, and talk about feather trails. The full name of the book is Feather Trails: A Journey of Discovery Among Endangered Birds. And it's a beautiful book. And as I said, one that teaches a lot about these different birds and bird conservation, but also a journey of yours over very different places in a long period of time. Your book is broken up into 3 parts, really around 3 very distinct birds: peregrine falcons, Hawaiian crows, which is a really interesting bird I didn't know anything about before reading, and then California condor, which we're still working to recover here in California. Talk about your trajectory. Your book starts, and you were recently arrived out west with the peregrine falcon hacking program. You had, I think, seen an advertisement back in Vermont. So just talk about what brought you to the work, and begin to tell us about the work with the peregrine falcons.
I had a somewhat similar start as Tina, in that I grew up loving animals, but I didn't know that there was such a thing as a wildlife biologist. I had no idea that if you loved animals, there was a career where you could work with wild animals. I thought since I liked animals, I could become a veterinarian. So I had tried working as a vet tech one summer, and I enjoyed it, but I really wanted to be helping wild animals. I instead did international relations and French literature in college, so that's how different my start was. And then after college, I was living in Washington, D.C., thinking that I might become a diplomat or something. And I just happened across a catalog that was sent to my roommate that was for a group called the School for Field Studies. And they host field programs all over the country. And they listed a program that was wildlife biology in Kenya. And I started reading the description of wildlife biology, which I'd never heard of. And it just sounded incredible. And I thought, this is what I want to be doing. But meanwhile, I had no science background. I had struggled like Tina with science. So anyway, I ended up taking a biology course that summer, getting a scholarship, going and doing that course in Africa. And you have to, I think, be brain dead if you don't get excited about wildlife in Africa. So I realized that was what I wanted to do. But then I had to go back to school to make up some coursework because I had no science background. So I had gone to the University of Vermont, which is where I grew up. And I happened to see during that first year this advertisement for work with peregrine falcons, reintroducing peregrine falcons to the world, to the wild in Wyoming. And so this was my first field experience, my first time working out west. And I went there, and I too was a neophyte. I hadn't camped much. We lived out of tents, and everything was pretty new. And we were in charge of looking after these 5 captive raised falcons that had been brought to our release site, placed up on top of a cliff in this big box, a hack box. They were in the box. We monitored them and gave them food for the first week, and then opened up the front of the box and released them to the wild. And at that time, peregrine falcons, as Tina said, they had been exterminated completely in the east. They disappeared in the northeast. They started declining in the 1950s and had disappeared by the 1970s. And then Tom Cade developed, along with others, captive breeding techniques and started reintroducing them to the East. By the time I did this first field job, it was the early 1990s, and peregrines had been reintroduced to the East, and reintroductions in the West were ramping up. And so they had the techniques down, but obviously I was very new at it. And I liked birds, but I wasn't captivated by birds at that time. I thought a mammal person, and I thought I wanted to work with small cats that are very secretive and people don't know about them. But when I spent a summer watching these peregrines, I became so captivated. It's the fastest bird in the world, fastest animal in the world. It was amazing watching these young birds learn to fly. And I became just captivated. There it is. It's such a magnificent and beautiful species, and I write about what it was like to watch them and observe them. And I just became so captivated, and I realized the wonderful thing about birds is they're so visible, they're vocal, they're around us all the time. A lot of the mammals that we might enjoy studying are very secretive, sometimes nocturnal, difficult to see, whereas so many birds have their whole lives on display for us. And I was just captivated by birds that summer, and that's when I decided I wanted to dedicate my whole life to helping birds.
It's incredible. And throughout your story, what I took away is just how complex bird reintroductions are. Different species have different stressors or different challenges, and there's a lot of sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Very much
But
so, yeah.
yeah, but before we get to Hawaiian crows, but so the peregrine falcon sounds like another success story, right? It was removed from the endangered species list.
That too it's one of our best conservation success stories. About 7,000 peregrines were reintroduced in North America, but what really, those reintroductions were critically important, and they helped accelerate the recovery of the peregrine. But as Tina suggested, what was really key for the peregrine falcon was the banning of DDT. That pesticide and other pesticides had absolutely decimated peregrine populations. And had we not eliminated that pesticide, they would have kept dying. They wouldn't have been able to recover. So that was essential. And there were some people working on the reintroduction side, and then there were many people working on the policy side. the first environmental lawsuits happened, a bunch of people working to get rid of DDT over the years. So that was key for peregrines.
Incredible. Now, the second bird that you featured, the Hawaiian crow, much more complex set of challenges, it sounds like, and to me, sounds like the jury's out in terms of whether it's how it's going, if it's going to survive in the wild long term. Can you just talk about that species? I learned a lot from the book about how smart ravens or crows are, and then how beloved this Hawaiian crow is.
Yeah, the Hawaiian crow is just a remarkable bird, and it was really one of the driving forces behind my wanting to write this book, because no one had ever heard about it. When I came back from Hawaii and talked about Hawaiian crow, it was a species that not many people knew about. And because it lived in Hawaii, people in Hawaii started learning about this incredible bird that only occurs on one island, the Big Island of Hawaii. But most people in North America didn't know about it. It didn't receive much funding. The recovery program struggled for years because it just didn't have the attention and the funding that more charismatic, better known species like the bald eagle, like the peregrine falcon had. But it is a remarkable bird. I mean, many people have come to love the crow and raven family. The Hawaiian crow is a corvid, part of the crow, raven, jay, nutcracker, magpie family. They're intelligent, they're gregarious, they're playful. The Hawaiian crow is more closely related to our raven than to the American crow. And most people, we look at our crows and they're opportunistic, and they live around places where we live, and they think, how can a crow be endangered? Really? They're so opportunistic. But the Hawaiian crow and a lot of the island living crows, especially crows that live in forested areas, are some of our most endangered birds. So the Hawaiian crow is the most endangered corvid in the world. And there are just a lot of pressures and challenges for animals that live on islands. So the Hawaiian crow and the birds in Hawaii evolved without land mammals. There were only other birds and other organisms, but no predators, no cats and rats and that kind of thing on the islands. But aside from destroying habitat, European colonizers and Polynesian colonizers brought animals like cats and rats and mongooses. And all of those predators had a tremendous impact on Hawaii's birds. The rats could climb into trees and kill nestlings. Hawaiian crows, when they left the nest, they would drop down to the ground and they would be unable to fly for several weeks as they developed their wings. And there they were acutely vulnerable to mongooses and cats. The other big thing in Hawaii is introduced diseases, and it has taken such a toll on Hawaii's birds that Hawaii is now sadly known as the extinction capital of the world. Mosquitoes were introduced to the islands in 1826, and they transmitted avian malaria and avian pox, which were two diseases that are really deadly to Hawaii's birds. Sometimes many of their famed honey creepers, which are native to that island, some of them will die from a single mosquito bite. And so that has really devastated Hawaii's native birds. And so between the predators, the diseases, the Hawaiian crows have really struggled to come back. And plus, for years, there was a lack of funding, which is why I wanted to try to help bring attention to the species.
That's incredible. For both the peregrine falcon and the Hawaiian crow, you as a conservation biologist would have to, in some cases you'd release a bird that then you need to bring back into so-called captivity, right? To help it gain health and then potentially re-release. I guess that was the condor and the Hawaiian crow.
The condor, yeah. In the Hawaiian crow situation, the environment had been messed up enough in Hawaii that their only native predator in the past had been the Hawaiian hawk, or Eo. And the Eos, there had traditionally been sort of a balance between the Hawaiian hawks and the Hawaiian crow, but over time that balance sort of got upended. So with these reintroductions that we were doing, the Hawaiian hawks started taking quite a toll on the Hawaiian crows. So in two different instances, after reintroductions, the recovery program ended up bringing the birds back into captivity because too many of them were getting killed. And so they wanted to try reintroducing them to a different habitat, which might have fewer hawks and things like that. And recently, so because of that ongoing problem, last fall, they finally reintroduced 5 crows. They were extinct in the wild for years. But they reintroduced 5 crows last year on the island of Maui, where the Hawaiian hawk doesn't occur. And so they're hoping that they can at least get the bird established there, and then they'll be able to hopefully use some of the techniques they've developed without that additional pressure, predation pressure, and bring the birds back to the big island of Hawaii.
It's amazing. So then the third part of the book is a very, very different bird, which is
Yes.
the California condor, one of the largest birds. As you share an observation in the book, a bird that a lot of people find ugly, but one that's really quite important, including to indigenous Native American tribes across the West. Talk about the condor, just as a bird, as a species, and then tell us how you became involved in its protection.
The condor is remarkable. I mean, it garnered such a following, I think in the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s. It is, some people think it's quite ugly up close. It's a big vulture with a bald head, but anyone who sees them flying is just captivated by them. I ran into so many people that would see it perched and say, oh my God, that's an ugly bird. And then it would take off, and they're so graceful and beautiful and massive in flight that the same person would say, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. So they would switch very quickly when they saw them flying. And the birds are also gregarious, they're intelligent, they're playful, they each had unique personalities. I try to describe some of their play behavior in the book because most people don't realize that vultures are incredibly playful. Like they love punting water bottles down a beach with their bill. So there was a lot more to them than meets the eye, and I wanted to share that side of them. But they really, because of their size and because they're just magnificent, they really captivated people in California especially, and then all over the West. And so it was remarkable to bring them back. It was heartbreaking in the 1980s. They were disappearing so quickly, and biologists weren't really sure why, until there were only 22 left. And after that, they started a captive breeding program. That took some time to develop the techniques, but the birds in the wild were dying so fast and just disappearing so quickly that they ended up capturing the few that remained in the wild to bring them into captivity and develop this captive breeding program. So that was a hugely controversial event at the time, bringing the last few condors in, because there were some people at the time that weren't sure they would breed in captivity. Would it be the same bird? Is a captive condor really a condor? Some people thought. They travel these extraordinary distances. They're magnificent flyers. How can you have them in captivity and call it a condor? So it was, captive breeding was still in its infancy and people weren't sure it was going to work. So bringing them into captivity was a really big controversy in the conservation world. A lot of people opposed that, but it did end up saving the condor. They bred really well in captivity. They started getting reintroduced to the wild 5 years later, and we started addressing some of the threats that had knocked their numbers back to some extent, but it was still quite a few years before people really realized that the bottom line problem with the condor was lead ammunition. Lead bullets fragment when they go into an animal, and they break into these tiny little particles, and so scavengers can't see or feel them, and they feed on these carcasses, and they ingest lead bullet fragments, and so they die of lead poisoning.
Yeah, and you point out in the book too that while there have been efforts, including in the state of California, to try to reduce lead in ammunition nationally, it's still a huge problem. and that the groups, oftentimes well, the National Rifle Association and the groups that represent some hunters continue to push back against the science that's, really clearly making links between animal mortality, but also even lead getting in the meat of that hunters are shooting and bringing back to their families or donating, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's an incredible issue. It's one of those situations where I think birds really reveal a threat in the environment by their numbers being reduced. As condors were dying of lead poisoning, what we didn't realize is we're also in feeding on carcasses that have been, or on animals that have been killed by hunters. And when we started X-raying deer that had been killed by hunters just out doing their thing, it was staggering to see the spread of tiny, tiny little lead particles that spread throughout the carcasses. And we learned that, human hunters were eating that as well. And one physician in North Dakota actually did a study where he x-rayed packages of venison that had been donated to a food bank. And he x-rayed 100 packages, 59% of them had visible lead fragments in them. And this was hunters just trying to be kind and help people in need. But it was getting into food banks. Hunters were eating meat that had lead ammunition fragments in it, feeding it to their families. And the hunter advocacy groups really say, lead ammunition isn't a problem. We've been hunting with it for years. No one's ever shown, any negative effects of hunting with lead bullets. But the tricky thing about lead is that a lot of the problems lead causes could be attributed to other things. It's heart issues or kidney issues or reproductive issues like infertility or miscarriages, joint pain, digestive concerns, increased rates of cancer. All those things are linked to lead, but there are other things that can contribute to those things. So people don't realize that their problems may be because they grew up eating meat that their dad was hunting, and a lot of people ingest lead. I had an acquaintance who, they were trying to do the right thing and they didn't want to eat cattle that might have hormones or hormones put into them, so they wanted to just live off the land and kill deer. But meanwhile, the guy's wife was pregnant and they were shooting with lead ammunition and they were feeding meat to his pregnant wife and then their kids growing up. And it's almost impossible to avoid ingesting lead if you're shooting with lead. California has been amazing because of the condor. It has reduced its use of lead ammunition. It's now banned the use of lead ammunition, but no other state is doing that. And mostly it's not even talked about, it's just not even an issue.
Well, and I'll share that we last month lost a reintroduced condor in the far northern part of the state, and the result was lead poisoning. So even in California, where the ammunition's now lead ammunition is banned, it's still a huge problem. I do want to share that one of the best days of my job is I got to go see a condor reintroduction in the Redwood National Park. Remarkable partnership of the Yurok tribe, which is our most populous Native American tribe in California, and the National Park Service to reintroduce California condor in the northern portion of its historic habitat. And I'm with you. I mean, there's nothing more beautiful than seeing them soar in the sky. And up there, they've been sort of a missing piece of the ecological puzzle because their beaks are so strong. They can rip into skin of marine mammals that sometimes wash up on the beaches that other animals like your turkey vultures or even like your coyotes or wolves can't get into. So they've now been this, catalyst for a lot of protein.
That's awesome.
I want to sort of transition here in our last half an hour into more of a group conversation. But the last question I want to ask you individually, Sophie, is your career has involved so much travel. I think of the word peripatetic.
Yeah.
Sort
Or
of
peregrine.
yeah, there you go. Sprinkled into these discussions about the three birds, all this work that you did in Latin America as well. So was that part of inspiration for the work, or is it something that you love doing, or you did because of the work?
It was sort of a bit of both. You know, I spent my early childhood in Switzerland before moving to Vermont, and I'd always loved traveling as I grew up. And one of the reasons I think I did international relations as an undergraduate is because I loved languages and travel and that kind of thing. So when I started getting into the world of wildlife, I realized, you know, there's a lot of research going on in different places. And so when I was seeking out my next field job, I would look in this ornithological newsletter and they might advertise a job in Guatemala. And I'd be like, oh, that would be a really interesting thing to do and an amazing place to work. And so I'd apply for it, and I got lucky sometimes and ended up, yeah, doing working on parrots in Guatemala, working on a duck in Argentina. I ended up working with an eagle in Peru. So I really enjoyed, aside from doing a lot of work in Western North America and also in Hawaii, I felt very fortunate to get to travel and work in Latin America a lot.
Yeah, I was envious reading about all the travels. And
It
Tina,
was great.
yeah, you translated that incredible experience in the 1970s into a career in conservation, both as a teacher, but then also as a land steward. Can you just talk about your, sort of what happened after that Eagle project and what you're doing today?
Yeah, well, I didn't travel like like Sophie did. After I left the Eagle Project, I got married, and we moved to Massachusetts, and we bought an old farm after a couple of steps along the way. We bought an old farm north of Boston and decided to make it into a wildlife refuge. And so my husband and I were both in the environmental field, and we just had a real interest in trying to bring back animals that really didn't have much habitat, especially in more urban areas. So we started managing for grassland birds and owls and birds of prey, but also for predators, predatory mammals. And so we've kind of done that for 30 years. We raised our four children here, and I had, you know, unlike Sophie, I had to sort of sit, okay, how do I stay still? I can't travel. I gave up research because I realized that any kind of research that I wanted to do was going to keep me away from home and away from my kids at a time of the year, like the summer, when they really needed somebody around. And so I started teaching, and I found I loved it. I loved being able to impart my knowledge of conservation and animals in general. And so I became a biology teacher and also an English teacher because I also love to write. And I kind of combined the two together, that you can learn about wildlife and biology, and you can also get outside of the lab. I think my problem with science, as I realized, wasn't that I wasn't good at it necessarily, although I probably wasn't. But what I really had a trouble with was being inside all the time and looking through a microscope and thinking about science in terms of chemistry or biochemistry or whatever. And my eyes were open in college to the fact that there was science outside, that I could go out there and learn about birds and wildlife in general and be outdoors. And I wanted to convey that to kids at a young age where they were making these kinds of decisions, because I felt like if anyone had ever done that for me, and I was in ninth grade or 10th grade, the beginning of high school, I could have gotten started a little bit earlier than I ended up being, because somebody would have opened my eyes to the fact, hey, this science is really fun. We can go outdoors and we can study animals, and it's really a different kind of science than we've ever thought of before. So I found that I just loved teaching and I loved education, and obviously having four kids, education became extremely important to me. And I just started
You
looking.
bring kids out to the farm. You bring your students out to your farm,
I
right?
brought them to the farm. Yep, our big field trip was coming to the farm and seeing, I would teach them about ecological succession, and we would come and look at the ecological succession we were doing all around the farm, where we were keeping fields mowed so that grassland birds could make their nests, and we'd only mow them after a certain period in July. Or we had trails through the woods, but we'd make sure that the trails avoided cutting down any big trees, and we'd make all kinds of we'd put up boxes for bluebirds and for owls, and everything that needed a box had a box. And we had bat boxes through the Fish and Wildlife Service in our barn. We have a really big barn. So we put bat boxes in there because we have 3 species of bats, and that's unheard of in this area, that bats are in such trouble in terms of the fungus and everything else that they're incurring, and pollinating plants and meadows of pollinators. So all of it I was teaching in the classroom, but then I would take them to the house, and we also built a nature trail in the school so that they could literally walk right outside and see everything there instead of just learning about it in a textbook. And
Yeah.
that was really important to me.
Well, and I think it's a really powerful reminder that those of us who are joining today, there's things that we can do in our life, even if, our professional career isn't focused on environmental restoration. Tina, you point out just practices that we can actually follow in our own communities or on our own land, which really matter.
Right.
We've been, even in our own yard, our small yard in Sacramento, really been trying to take out, the non-native plants and get plants that pollinators like. And so now we've got this incredible bush in the backyard that has bumblebee, bees buzzing. And as we know, pollinators need more of that habitat. So really helpful to understand and inspiring to understand all the work that you guys have done on your land. Sophie and Tina, I want to ask you, both of you in the book, I think, write in a really compelling way about just being, sort of trailblazers as women in this field. And Sophie, I think you had pointed out that you had experienced, conduct from managers that only later was, identified as things like gender bias, right? Can you just talk, each of you, about what the experience was like and how you tapped into resilience to continue to, forge forward in a male-dominated field that wasn't always welcome to your, your expertise?
Yeah, I tried not to belabor it too much in my book, because I wanted the focus to stay on the birds, but I wanted to mention, that it was really challenging, being a woman doing the work that I was doing, because if there are any women getting into this work and struggling today, I wanted them to know, that people understood, and that you can dig deep and do some great work despite the challenges. But there were many challenges, and some of them were very subtle. Some of them were literally every time I started a new field job, I had to start from scratch. No one ever took my past experience for granted. No one ever said, oh, you've done these 10 field jobs, and if you're telling me what to do, you probably know what you're talking about. I got challenged always by young men on my field crew who wouldn't take what I was asking them to do seriously without challenging it. And I literally felt like every job I had to start from scratch and prove to them that I could do it. Whereas my male colleagues, if they went and said, go and do such and such, everyone said, okay, yeah, great, because they assumed they knew all this stuff. They had this background. And sometimes I would have a male colleague tell my field crew, ask them to go do this. And when it came from him, there would be no challenge. But when I went and told them, they had to ask why and couldn't we do this, and so it was subtle, but it was just, that could be frustrating. There were far more blatant things, like just inequities in pay were staggering. I was more qualified than a colleague. I had years more experience. I had a master's degree, he had a college degree, and he got paid more than twice what I did. So there were those kinds of inequities that were fairly obvious. And then there was just a lot of discrimination. Sometimes, a boss would never speak to me and give me instructions, but he would speak to my male colleague and give them the instructions and then the tasks, even though I was doing the same work. So there was just some was subtle and some was very obvious. But for me, it was challenging at times, but the birds made it easy, because no matter what, I wanted to be there for the birds. I wanted to protect the birds. I put everything aside so that I could help these amazing creatures, that I was tasked with helping. And so I think that helped me dig deep a lot of times. I never thought, oh, I had to carry extraordinary amounts of weights. I had to be out, in the middle of nowhere with trucks breaking down. And I just had to get creative about how to get myself out of trouble when I got into trouble. And I never felt like, oh, I can't do this, because like Tina said, you just felt like, I'm not going to admit I can't do this because I'm not strong enough. I will find the strength and do it. And so, I think a lot of women who worked in our generation found an incredible physical and emotional and mental strength to just dig deep and do the job that needed to be done, no matter how challenging it was.
Truly inspiring. And to hear just also discouraging around the pay inequities and the gender bias. And I think we'd be naive to suggest that is only a relic of the past. It's something we continue to navigate and to confront. Tina, how about you? You talk about being a woman doing this work and this groundbreaking work in 1976, 50 years ago.
Yeah, there weren't any. And maybe that was helpful for me because there were no expectations one way or the other that I was a woman and therefore I would immediately fail, or and there didn't seem to be the people that I worked with, the Peregrine people, and they were all falconers and most of them were from the West. And you would have expected them to treat me differently because I couldn't have been more different. They didn't. And I thank them to this day because they really had faith that I could do this. And part of it comes from on high. Tom Cade had faith in me. And because he did, he kind of transmitted that to the people that worked for him. And because, unlike Sophie, I was alone. So I didn't have to answer to anybody. And I didn't have to give directions to anybody. They had to follow me because I was the only one who knew what to do. So when the New York State people would come up to try to learn from me how to do the program, they really were learning from me because they didn't know how to start. And that, I guess, made it feel a little bit more equal because I never had to worry about somebody not listening to me. If I said you do it this way, they had to do it that way. They didn't know how to do it differently. But I think it all really started with the Peregrine team, that they were just extremely helpful and understanding, and they never treated me in any other way other than a colleague. And even though I didn't know what I was doing, and they did never made me feel that way. And I began to be more confident about asking for help, and not feeling stupid every time I asked a question. So it really was an amazing gift that I was in that position. And but at the time, there were no female raptor biologists that I knew of anyway. I mean, maybe there's one out there that's going to come on and say, yes, I was there. It was a long time ago, and I think that we really were those people who were doing this in the 1970s and even before were real trailblazers. And I'm so sad to think that it didn't completely change after that, that women weren't jumping into this field and being treated equally and being paid equally. That makes me very discouraged that it didn't work that way. Um, and I've seen it. I've seen it in other fields, obviously, that I've been involved in. But there is nothing that a woman can't do with wildlife that a man can do. So I hope that people start realizing that they can go into this field, women can go into this field and they can do just as good a job. I think they also have a sensitivity that's very important to have in the field. That you do really, as Sophie said, you want to save those birds. And not that men don't, they absolutely do. But I think there is something that really, that women really appreciate about the natural world, that they should be out there more and doing it. And I think they are to a certain degree.
Yeah, and I have to say, where in my work, I'm so gratified to work with so many women leaders who are now leading agencies that were traditionally led by men. We celebrated Women's History last March, and we did a panel of the 5 key coastal protection agencies in the state for the first time. They're all run by women. So we had a great conversation, and invariably, a lot of these women were, the first in their positions as women. So remarkable progress there. I want to turn to the writing and the book aspect, because not only have you guys had done this incredible work, you've written about it, and you published about it. But before we did that, Sally, who's joining, asked a question about bird flu, and I don't know if either of you would know, but she's wondering how bird flu could affect the wild bird population, and is there anything we can do as homeowners to help?
Do you want
Um,
me to?
oh,
Oh.
go ahead, Sophie.
Well, and you may have, I'll let Tina answer this too, but yes, we are all very worried about bird flu. And particularly, I've been hearing that, peregrines were such a success story, but they are apparently getting hard hit by avian flu, especially during their migration, or the coastal species that feed more on large aggregations of birds, shorebirds and waterfowl. So wherever there's large aggregations of birds, avian flu is more likely to be transmitted, and peregrines that are feeding on shorebirds and waterfowl that have contracted avian flu are dying. So a lot of dead peregrines are found on migration. A lot of peregrines, especially on the coasts, aren't returning to their nesting territories. I each year monitor birds in Montana, peregrines in these mountains that I live near in Montana. And I was so worried this year of all years that our peregrines wouldn't have come back from migration. I was very gratified that so far the two territories I've monitored, the birds have returned. And I have heard that peregrines in the center of the country are doing better. But as far as what we can do, when we do have bird feeders, keep them clean, keep your water sources clean, and if you are feeding birds, keep them clean to just reduce any potential transmission is the best advice I can give. And Tina, if you have anything else.
Well, it's affected eagles a lot. And I think that my message is always, it's great to see so many bald eagles, but don't think that it's always going to be this way. Because I think people get very complacent and they think, oh, the eagle's back. Well, the eagle is back, but he's got a lot of threats out there. And avian flu right now is the #1 threat. Because bald eagles live on, or, are scavengers and they're opportunistic, they also love big flocks of things. So they can go after snow geese, for example, that migrate down through New England, all Pennsylvania, all the way to Virginia in huge numbers. And those snow geese are picking up avian flu on the way down, and the eagles are feasting on them along the Connecticut River, the Hudson River, and all the way through Pennsylvania into the Chesapeake. And they're finding the birds dead along the way. There were 5,000 snow geese found dead in Pennsylvania last winter, and 1,000 found dead in the Hudson Valley in New York. And people will see eagles feasting on the ice on snow geese and think, oh, isn't that great? The eagle's back and he's got a nice meal. Well, if you're seeing that, it's usually because that bird was probably dead to begin with, and the eagle went after him as a dead bird. And because they're lazy. And if they find dead snow geese or any kind of waterfowl, they will go and eat them. And one of the scariest things was Minnesota was one of the sources of my eagles. And the biologists that went up to band young in Minnesota found out that all the nests they went to were empty, and those birds were dying of avian flu. So it's a very serious problem. And as Sophie said, worse along the coast, Georgia and Florida, really bad, South Carolina, but it's everywhere. It's along all the water sources because of all the waterfowl that it's being hit with it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for addressing that. I learned a lot in both of those answers, and Sally for the question. One key lesson for me is, recovery can't be a mission accomplished. To your point, it's not like it's static, Tina, and it's not like we can't or we have to worry about continued challenges to these bird populations. But let's talk about mission accomplished, which is both of you published books that we can read and order. I don't know who wants to go first, but when did you get the idea for the story, and how did the process come together to actually result in what I'm holding in my hands?
Well, I'll start. I think my process was sort of ongoing. When I found one of my eagles in 2015, that I had released in 1977, was found dead by the side of the road at the age of 1938, which was the oldest living bald eagle in history. And he was one of my hack birds. I just sat there and said, I was teaching at the time, and I said, someday I have to honor that bird. And he probably was responsible for 70 young in the 35 years that he nested. So he really owed it. And then I sort of had been thinking about it every time somebody told me they'd seen a bald eagle in their backyard, or they saw, 10 flying over Route 95 or whatever. I'd think, do they know that they were gone and that somebody had to bring them back? And I felt like the story needed to be told. And Tom Cade, I always thought would eventually tell it, but he was very interested in the Peregrine program. And when he died in 2019, I realized I have to tell the story. I have to tell the story for a lot of reasons. And so that's where I sort of started writing the book in sort of chunks. It wasn't really intended to be a book. It was sort of going to be a long essay, and then it kept going in both directions. So the middle part is about the Eagle Project. The beginning is how I got there. The end is about what effect did it have on my life afterwards. So I guess that was sort of how I began.
Wow. How about you, Sophie? I know you wrote another book about condor in the Canyonlands that won an award, but how about this one?
I had written that one when I had just, or I think I was either still working with condors or finishing. A local press was looking for somebody to write about condors, and they came to one of my talks and asked if I could recommend somebody to write a book about condors, and I was like, I'd like to, because I loved writing, and I had been writing field notes every few weeks for online to let people know what was happening with the Condor Project. So that's at least how I started writing that book. But it was also, they had some ideas about what they wanted in a book, and I really wanted to write about my field experiences. But more than anything, I felt like I had had an opportunity to work with some amazing endangered birds, and one of the tragic things about working with endangered birds is there's often so few individuals left. But the silver lining to that is you come to know those individuals really well. And I ended up working with birds that were each unique. They had different personalities, they had histories and stories. And I felt like I had a really unique opportunity to share those individual stories. And my hope was that in telling those bird stories, I might get people to care about the birds and come to, hopefully they would come to love them, maybe not quite as much as I did, but at least somewhat. And when people come to care about individuals, they often care more about the species and care about what happens to that species. And so I thought I might be able to inspire people to want to conserve and protect these birds by coming to know these individuals that I had worked to save. I also, when I was working at Grand Canyon, whenever I was doing the condor work and pulled out a radio transmitter, everyone would run, all these tourists would gather around and ask what I was doing and ask about the birds. And inevitably they'd start asking, how did you get this job? What do you do? And they wanted to know more about it. And so I felt like by telling sort of my stories about becoming and being a wildlife biologist, working with these species, I could also, captivate people with those more personal stories. So I could share what had happened to these birds and the threats they faced, but couch it in stories about, how I came to work with them and what that work was like day to day. So.
I have to say, you both do such a great job educating us about these birds, but through a human story.
Yeah.
And I'm not somebody who can sit and read really a lot of dry scientific books, and these are both page turners. You both published, I think, with Chelsea Green, and I'm just interested, for those of us who haven't written a book before, what's it like to take the desire to write a book or the beginning of a manuscript and then work it through a process that results in something getting published?
Hard.
I was going to say the same thing. It's hard. It's a long process.
It's a long process. Everyone told me it was going to be really hard to get it published. I wrote very much of a hybrid memoir because it's part science, part personal narrative. And those are really hard to get published because nobody knows what shelf to put them on in the bookstore. Is it really a memoir? So it's for people who just want to know about someone's life, or is it a bird book? And mine is neither or both, I guess. So I knew it was going to be an uphill struggle. And I skipped the agent part of it because that was really hard, trying to find someone to take a chance on a book like that and not knowing what to do with it. And luckily, I found Chelsea Green, who was very interested in nature and sustainable living, and luckily had an editor who was a birder and who was really interested in the story. So, but it's very difficult to get books published in this day and age, and just to even find an agent that will carry it through.
Yeah. And you and your acknowledgments, I think you thank a bunch of people, including one of your daughters. You probably need a good support network to actually keep you moving forward.
You really do. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
very lucky. I had two writers in my family who kept looking at my pathetic drafts and saying, they were very polite about it, but I had to keep going back to the drawing board and redoing it. So yeah, I was very lucky.
Yeah. How about you, Sophie?
It is a really hard process. My book was much too long to begin with, and so that became an uphill battle because no one wanted to publish a longer book. I did try to go the agent route. I spent a year trying to get an agent, and it can be so frustrating at times because a lot of the agents live in New York, and I would, here I had this bird book, and they were like, well, I don't know if people are really interested in birds. And, being part of the bird world, I'm like, 96 million people watch birds, love birds. It's a big chunk of people, but it was alien to them. And so they couldn't imagine that there would be a big audience for this type of book. So anyways, I tried for a year to get an agent. I did finally get one, and I had her for about 9 months, and then she ghosted me just after the pandemic and just never, she said she was going to send me a edited version of my book, and then never, she disappeared. So I spent another year trying to start again and get an agent, and then decided that was just not working, and ended up starting to look at small presses. And I also got lucky and tried Chelsea Green, and both Tina and I were so lucky that there was an editor there who was a bird person and loved birds, and immediately saw the potential of books that were about reintroducing endangered birds, and realized that there was an audience out there for that. So
Wow. Well, I have to say, as Leslie said, it's independent. It was Independent Bookstore Day, I think, yesterday, and my great bookstore down the road here, East Sacramento Books, was having a party, and to me, it's just just reminds us of the importance of independent publishing houses, and because these are the entities that help tell stories like yours, and I'm thankful for Chelsea Green and other publishers like them, because I feel
we are too.
yeah, I feel very, very glad that I read both of your books. As we come to the top of the hour and the end of the discussion here today, just want to invite you to reflect any final thoughts that you have as we look to the future. We're obviously dealing with a lot of environmental challenges right now, including a lot of environmental attacks through politics. And your books are both really hopeful. So anything you want to reflect on here as we move into the future, given all that you've experienced in your lives and careers?
Well, I think the fact that the word hopeful is very important. I think they are positive stories, and we hear so many negative stories about the environment these days that people need to hold on to those and keep up keep the faith, because things can change. Things were really bad for a while in the 1980s, and then they turned around, and the politics and everything changes from every 4 years, and things will come back. And I think that we all have to be aware of that. And the more people who write about it, and also getting the word out with the bookstores as well, putting them on the front shelves. People want to read about the environment, and they want to read about people's stories of what they've done that is positive. So
Yeah,
it's
And
so
that,
well put.
I would just say about mine, one of my hopes was, I felt like we live in a time where we're so overwhelmed by environmental problems, especially really massive, complex problems like climate change. And I think it tends to make us feel hopeless. And I wanted to show that targeted conservation efforts really do work. When we want to work to preserve a species or habitats, we can make it happen. We have made it happen. We did do it with the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon. We're making huge strides with condors. And I wanted people not to feel powerless. And there are a lot of problems that birds have that are things that we can affect in our daily lives, like not using pesticides or putting decals on our windows, or like you said, growing native plants, not hunting with lead ammunition, keeping our cats indoors. All those things are small measures that we can take that make a huge difference for birds. And as I said, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimated that 96 million of us love and watch birds. And I publish a Substack blog that just tries to show that if each of us does something, anything, if there are 96 million of us doing some small measures to help birds, that can make a real difference in the world. And so I didn't want people to feel hopeless. I want people to feel empowered, that conservation can work and we can make change happen.
That's such such a powerful way to end our discussion here today. And as you're seeing in the webinar chat, there are many that are taking that inspiration. And as Leslie put in, she put in the links where you can actually find these books and purchase these books. And I would say they are powerful antidotes to hopelessness or discouragement. And so thank you for the conversation and everything that you've done in your careers and through writing this book. And Leslie, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting, and I learned a ton. And now, of course, I'm afraid of lead and any animals that we might eat. So thank you, Sophie and Tina and Wade. Great job moderating. I was so funny when you said you were jealous of Sophie's travels. I don't know anyone who's traveled more than Wade. I think he's probably been to 16 countries in the last year.
That's amazing.
But
Well, I'm gonna be a wildlife ecologist in my next life. That's also what I'm envious about.
That's great.
But
Well,
thank you all so much, and thank you to everyone who came to watch and who's been part of the festival this session. And I hope you have a great afternoon.
thank you for everything.
Thank you. Thank
care.
you all for
Bye.
coming.
Take care.